Welcome everybody to my first AOS Tactics Beyond the Basics video. In this series, I'm going to be talking about some basic AOS tactics, and then they're kind of some of the more advanced or applications that you might see in competitive play, or just nuances of mechanics that that weren't immediately obvious. And so the first one I'm going to focus on is the pile-in mechanic for Age of Sigmar. At the NashCon event this last weekend, I played my co-host for Warhammer Weekly, Vince Ventrella, in the fourth game, and we had a disagreement on how pile-in works. And since then, he has admitted that no matter how beardy it might be, I was right on how the mechanics work. And so what I wanted to talk about was what some of the applications of pile-in are beyond just simply moving towards the nearest, like a model, a unit you just charged or whatever. So we're going to talk about the basics, and then we're going to move on to some of the more advanced mechanics. And so I hope that this will help elevate people's games and help them this video, and hopefully this series to move beyond just simply playing kind of on a autopilot and really analyzing battlefields and figuring out how to be strategic in everything they're doing. Because the reality is that some of these moves and some of these kind of tactical approaches with pile-ins can win a game. And in fact, I would argue that in one of these did win me a game this last weekend against a very good player who ended up finishing third at NashCon. And so one of these pile-in tactics was instrumental in that. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to walk through a number of these applications of pile-in. So here we go. So AOS tactics beyond the basics, piling in. The basics of pile-in are just simply this. A unit could pile in if it's selected. It can be selected to pile in after one of these conditions are met. Either a unit is charged in the prior phase, or a unit has models within 3 inches of an enemy unit. Now, units within 3 inches of an enemy unit must be selected to attack. And this is interesting because the player whose turn it is, this is a direct quote from the AOS rules, page 3, column 3. The player whose turn it is picks a unit to attack, and then the opposing player picks an attack, and so on until all eligible units on both sides have attacked once each. Now, units aren't forced to pile in, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but they are forced to be selected to attack. And if people are within range, they're often going to just default pile in. And this can also be, getting somebody into a combat that they didn't anticipate, has them already on the back foot because they're making decisions, unplanned decisions now as to whether they pile in. And if they do decide to pile in, what inevitably end up happening is they may make bad calls because they hadn't thought through that, and so which can then lead to more opportunities to capitalize on. So the next aspect of the basic unit of the function of pile-in is that units who pile in may move each model in the unit up to 3 inches towards the closest enemy model. The first thing I want to highlight about this this statement from the rules is that the movement, this pile-in movement, is voluntary. You don't, if you activate a unit or choose to activate a unit, each model, you make a decision whether you want to pile them in towards the nearest enemy model or not. If you do pile in, each model piles in towards the nearest enemy model. This is super important. It's been clarified in the FAQ, because what this means is that you don't have to actually pile in towards a unit you charged if it's not the unit, if those models aren't the closest models. And this can have a variety of applications that we're going to talk about. And then finally, this movement is measured by the distance between two models. So you're piling in towards the smallest distance between each model is measured between that model and another model. So as long as that distance is getting smaller, the model doesn't travel more than 3 inches, the pile-in is legal. And so this is going to have a variety of applications, but let's just look at this, like the simple kind of application of this now. So we have 2 units, a red and a blue unit. And what I've done is I've identified it's the red unit's turn to pile in. You can see that this model here ended its charge real close, within a ½ inch. Some of these are farther. Maybe this model right here is a little bit farther than an inch. But what I did was identified with vectors all of the different pile-ins like all of the models that each model has to pile in towards. Okay, this is really important because what ends up happening is that as long as you're making that distance, that arrow smaller, it is a legal pile-in. And the model doesn't move more than 3 inches. That's the other qualification. So the arrow has to get smaller. The model can't move farther than 3 inches. So what that might look like is something like this. I've duplicated the vector graph on the top, and then I went down below, and you can see a number of these models moved. Down here in the middle of this guy that had completed the charge, he shifted in, and he moved into base-to-base contact with both the guy he had to move closer to and then the guy right next to him, right here in the middle. This guy back here moved forward. So these are just general understandings. But if you move towards the flank, you're going to see some interesting stuff. This guy right here had to move towards this model, which he did. But when he did so such that both models are equidistant. So next time he piles in, he has to get closer to one of these two models, which will give me flexibility with this model on the pile-in. This guy had to move towards this guy, which he did just a straight pile-in. Or I'm sorry, this guy had to move closer to this guy. So this guy moved into this gap to be equidistant. This guy had to move this way, but he rotated just a little bit to be right here. This guy had to get closer to this guy, and he did. But when he did so, see, it was the difference between this distance and this distance. That distance got smaller, but when he ended his pile-in, he ended up being closer to this guy, which is legal, because this distance got smaller to this guy. Then, over here, this guy, this distance had to get smaller, but what he did was he rotated around here. And so, as long as this distance is 1 inch, maintain coherence, and this distance from this edge of his base to this edge is less than 3 inches, which it is in this instance. I'm assuming these are all 25 mil models. He can rotate around. And you can see this rotation happening back here. You can see this guy moving equidistant, and you can see kind of how this has played out. And so this is going to move. I'm transitioning using this basic model to show how some advanced applications of this. So the first of these is the rotation. And using the same set of pictures, the rotation uses the pile-in movement to rotate around an enemy base, possibly switching the nearest enemy for the next pile-in. So, and I want to point that out over here. This pile-in for this guy right here moved me closer to, on the left flank, the left forward, moved me closer to this guy. But in doing so, it actually changed my next pile-in target towards this guy. It's the simplest of the pile-in rule applications, and since the distance you need is getting smaller, you can actually use that movement to rotate around the enemies that you aren't in base-to-base contact with. And the rotation often becomes the gateway to all the other advanced tactics. So let's talk about the next one, the next advanced tactic, which is the hook. So for the hook, the rotation uses the pile. This next application is an extension of the rotation, and it may seem like a non-intuitive application of the pile-in rules, but it can be devastating. And I'm actually using an example of the example that I talked about in from NashCon this weekend against a Tzeentch player. He had his big Zangor unit in front. He had a big block of 9 Skyfires in back. My Chaos Warriors came and crashed into the Zangor, and on my turn, they killed a bunch, and then on his turn, he piled in with the Zangors and did a bunch more damage. But in doing so, he had lost some Zangor, and so when he removed those models, he removed a very strategic model right here. What ended up happening is removing this model ended up costing him the game. So with the hook, what you do is when you would do a rotation on a pile-in, a model that's piling in can rotate in such a way that while moving closer to their nearest enemy, so I want you to watch this model right here. This is the one I have piling in. I'm moving closer to this model. Now, when he positioned, let me just back up. When he positioned these Skyfires, I'm sure that he was like, well, what? I'm 5-6 inches off the front of my line. I'm fine. I'm not going to get into combat. 4 inches off the back of his own unit. So like there's no way I'm gonna, I'm sure when he set those down, he was confident that he had enough distance. But what ended up happening is that when I piled in, I rotated doing the rotation, this model around. And so you can see what ended up happening was this guy rotated down, this guy closed the distance and shifted over, and I shifted all these guys over to maintain coherence. And this guy shifted around here to the back, and this distance got smaller, so it was a legal pile-in. But what ended up happening was it moves me within 2 inches of this back unit. This is still 1 inch, 1 inch, 1 inch. And when I moved within 2 inches of that unit, it drew this unit of Skyfires into combat. It hooks them into combat, hence the name. And that means that now those Skyfires, they have to choose to activate. And if they choose to activate, they don't have to pile in. They can stay where they're at, and that's fine. But the big deal is that they can't actually move away now. They're stuck in combat. They're locked in because they're going to start their movement phase within 3 inches of an enemy unit. And because of that, what's going to end up happening is either they're going to have to just stay there until that Chaos Warrior, in this instance, it was Chaos Warrior, until that unit was deleted, which the guy never did. Or they have to retreat out and they're going to lose a round of shooting, which is real bad for a unit of 9 Skyfires, as you might imagine. And it's funny because he needed those 9 Skyfires to go delete one of my heroes because this was 3 places of power. And he couldn't get line of sight from where he was at. And what ended up happening was he couldn't get away, and he didn't have enough time. And I ended up chewing through a lot of this Skyfire unit because because they got drawn into combat. So one special application of this hook tactic is you can actually use it to extend your charge range. So let's imagine 2 units. One, let's imagine we have like a Zangor unit, Zangor in blue, Skyfire in teal, and my Chaos Warrior unit or whatever in red. The Skyfires are at a safe 14-inch distance from the Chaos Warrior unit. The Zangor are in an immediate threatening right off their, the front of the unit, 6 inches. So let's imagine that I on my Chaos Warriors, I make a charge roll, and I can't declare a charge against the Skyfire unit. They're 14 inches out. Maximum is 12 inches. But I can, I can roll a charge. And let's say I roll a 9 Chaos Warriors, it would be a 10. So let's say I have a 10-inch charge, very respectable charge. That was clearly going to carry I could choose to carry all of those models into combat with the blue unit and kind of wrap them around the back and the sides and completely engulf that unit. That's one way that I could go. But there's another way, and it's very important if this is done right. Instead of doing that, I could shift my models over. So from this left flank, I could have them and be the models that end within this distance, and shift everything over and run a leg out from my unit towards these Skyfires. Now, when I do that, as long as I'm ending within a ½ inch of the enemy unit, you can move in any direction on your charge while you're maintaining coherency with the rest of your unit. So this means that you can hit the closer unit with, which is what I've done here. This shows where the charge, I've made contact here with that far model. Everything is kind of shifted over, but I've ran some of my models out towards that other Skyfire unit. Now, I'm not going to be able to get within melee range. Like, I'm not going to be able to, the charge is still 4 inches out. Okay. But when determining for pile-ins, you have to pile in towards the nearest enemy model. And so what I've shown those vectors. And you can see, again, this unit out here, the closest enemy model is this Skyfire unit. Maybe not I may have did a wrong vector on this back one. I think this guy's still closer. But these guys, are definitely closer to that Skyfire unit. And so what ends up happening is when I pile in, every model piles in towards the closest enemy. So this is where I was at the end of the charge. And then I move 3 inches of my pile-in. The tail then piles in towards the nearest enemy model. And for that tail, that's that Skyfire unit. So what ends up happening is I end up ending a bunch of models 2 inches out from that Skyfire unit. Now, again, I don't get to attack. Okay? I'm still out of my own weapon reach. I'm still in coherency, and you can see that all the way. And you can see how these vectors have changed based on who is where and what models are closer. But now that enemy unit, in this instance, again, I'm pretending it's a Skyfire unit, they're now within close combat range. They're going to start their turn within 3 inches of an enemy unit, which means they can't zoom off and shoot my back line, for example. They have to either retreat or pile in. This is particularly helpful for locking range units into combat by either not charging them and piling into them, which this is real important for like handgunners. Handgunners have a stand and shoot if you end a charge within a half inch. Well, guess what? You don't end a charge within a half inch. You charge something else, you stay farther than 3 inches away, and then you pile in into the handgunners. When you do that, they lose their bonuses and they lose that free round of shooting. It's a real big kick in the teeth when, you know, they have set up this gun line and you basically negate one of their big, you know, damage kind of porcupine abilities by charging something else that they've placed badly out front. And then it's also good to help prevent units from zooming away. The key here is that you need to have enough bodies in the tail to pile in and make the full distance. And so here you'll have enough bodies. You'll probably get 3 of these models into contact with this enemy unit, even if they don't pile in. And you'll have enough bodies here to make the tail to stretch it out. Now, it's funny because a lot of these tactics only work when you have 20 models or 30 models. And a lot of AOS isn't running that many models, and so most of this doesn't ever occur, and so people don't have to deal with these type of pile-in shenanigans. But I think this is a strength of larger model lists, and as we move away from the mega big multi-wound models, which I think we're going to with all the shooting and all the the ability to project focused fire against units. The meta will move towards more larger armies to help kind of combat that, give target saturation. And I think that people are going to see more of these pile-in tactics start to occur. And if they're not prepared for them, if they're not thinking about them, they're going to get caught unaware and lose games because of them. Okay, so the next advanced tactic is what I call, moving on from the hook, is the bait. This is a very common tactic. A lot of people use this already. But for newer players, they may not realize that this can be done, and it can make some units that are arguably bad or weaker in defense, but really good in offense. It can make them a lot better. And so when you do a bait, this is basically using the same insights from the hook, which is having a unit like pile in that's out of combat, having a pile in into combat. But you're going to use them defensively in this instance. And so this tactic is going to be used when you want one unit to take a charge from an enemy unit, but you want a second unit to actually be the one to do the fighting in the combat. So what you do is you position your first unit intervening between you and the enemy unit. And so this dark blue is this intervening unit. The teal is the unit that you actually want to be the one that's going to do all the combat damage. This dark unit is your bait, hence the name, the bait. And the teal is your combat unit. This red unit is, like, let's say it's bloodletters or whatever. They're coming in hot. And they're going to do a bunch of damage. Well, that's great. They're going to delete a unit that's the bait. It's useless. It's chaff. And then they're going to get hit in the face with that rear unit, whether it be Blight Kings or Sky or Enlightened or whatever else those things are. Those heavy ogres, those heavy hitting models in the back. So what you do is you have to place the combat unit 2 to 2.5 inches off the back or off the front of your allied unit. It depends on what's charging and what their reach is as to how much you want to push this. But you need to be real careful that they're not too close, because if they're too close, then they're going to be what's going to be attacked after when the enemy piles in, because they can wedge into the gaps and maybe get some attacks on that back unit. You don't want that. So you got to be careful and make sure there's multiple contact points at this 2 to 2.5 inch, where I've kind of shown with these multiple lines. And this is important because when they come in, you need to, they could position, if you only have one contact point, in such a way that their coherency keeps them out of your pile-in range. They can create a little bubble in their own line that still lets them delete that blue unit and keep the teal unit out of combat. And so this is very straightforward. The enemy unit charges, piles in. They're going to delete the dark blue unit, and it's going to allow, or they're going to do damage probably to the dark blue unit. And you have more activations in this combat now, so you can wait them out. So the red unit, even if they choose not to activate in this against the blue unit, and they activate some other unit, you can activate then the blue unit and do damage to them and thin out that red unit before the dark blue unit gets deleted. So it's really a lose-lose situation for them, because they basically, in order for them to not take heavy casualties from the dark blue unit, they have to activate first and kill the dark blue unit, or do significant damage to that dark blue unit. But by doing that, then they're opening themselves up, because the dark blue are going to models are going to get removed, which is going to help move those teal models into range. And if they don't do that, then they're going to take casualties from the blue, and then they're also going to take casualties from the teal when the teal activates. So it's really a lose-lose. This is a particularly helpful tactic when you want to lock particularly helpful tactic when for units that have a real heavy offensive punch but a real kind of terrible defense. What comes to mind, for example, are the Zangor Enlightened, where they want the other unit to actually activate before them, which is great for this. Mirage 8112 on the kind of the mega Let's Chat Zinch thread on TGA talked about this recently. And I mean, again, this is a tactic that's well known among a lot of the more competitive players, but it's particularly true with the Enlightened. But it also works with, again, Ogres and any other of those kind of units that are heavy offense but have a lighter or weaker defense. And so the final tactic, and then this is what it looks like when they pile in. Okay, so the final tactic is the lockdown. Now, this is going to be, this is probably one of the most controversial applications of pile-in, and most people either don't realize that they can do this or don't have the tools available, because it's a very specific set of circumstances where this tactic is available. For this tactic, you need your piling in unit to have flying. Okay, and while this this does limit how many units actually can do this type of tactic, because again, the piling unit has to have fly. But a lot of factions have the ability to give fly to a unit. Chaos can do this with Sail. Death can do this with Nephrata and her Dark Mist. And so there are ways to kind of give flying. Otherwise, there are a number of flying units potentially that you could use this with. The other thing that you need is you need to have the enemy stretched out in a line, or at least have holes in their back line and not be packed with models. And so what you would do with this, with what I call the lockdown, is since your unit has fly, they can ignore enemy models on the pile-in movement, so that they can pile into the other side of the enemy line, as long as they're moving closer to the nearest model. That's always the rule, and as long as they're staying within 3 inches. They're not moving more than 3 inches. So rather than having to pile around and rotate around, they just pile in across the enemy line. So when they do this, you can see here, you can maintain coherency, and you want to move your coherency model first. You can see that over here. I have a 1-inch coherency here, and then everybody else is still in coherency. And you can see I've moved everybody so that the pile-ins, that front line is the ones that hopped, and the back line are the ones that engaged, that moved towards their models that they were required to move towards. Coherency was maintained. So when you did this and you maintain coherence in the gap, you're going to have to maintain coherence in the gaps often because of the bases. What's going to happen is you're going to intermingle your unit with their unit. This is really important because this has a non-inconsequential consequence, which is they can't retreat anymore. They're stuck until they move a number of models from their unit to remove coherency. They're stuck. They're not going anywhere. And really good players know how to use retreat to the best of its capabilities. Most people, when they get locked into combat, they just start hacking away, and they don't think about the strategic retreat movement, especially for objectives. And so because of the way that this works, you jump to the other side of them, lock them in. So with my Chaos Warrior unit in my large Plaguebound warband that I regularly use, like a 28 block of Chaos Warriors and Sail, I'll fly them out in a big long line, and most of the time my enemies, and I'll charge like 3, 4, 5 units. And the enemies normally will spread out to maximize models. They're going to spread out to maximize their attacks. And when they do that, what it allows me to do when I pile in is to jump to the other side of their line with a handful of models and intertwine my unit with their unit all the way down. Which what end up happening is that all those units now are locked into combat, and until models are removed by either me or them that allows them to retreat, those units aren't going anywhere. They're stuck in combat. You know, and when it's my list, they're stuck in combat with a 3-up reroll 1 save unit with a 5-up ward save and another 5-up against mortal wounds. And so it's just in a 2-wound model is 56 wounds. It's ugly. And so they're going to be in combat and -2 to hit in the first round of combat, -1 to hit in all the rest of the rounds of combat. So they're going to be stuck in combat with me for 2, 3, 4 rounds of combat, and it's going to be painful. And so those are some of the more what I would consider kind of advanced tactics. Those are what I would consider some of the advanced tactics for piling in. If you don't agree with any of these, any of my readings of these, sound off in the comments below. I want to hear your feedback. Maybe tell me some stories of how you've used pile in to just to win a game. And I hope that that this series can be something that helps folks kind of step up their game to the next level. So thanks for tuning in, and I will catch you all next time.